All right, so we've gone live. Juaniska, bom dia, good morning to everybody who's joining us. I'm so excited for today. Candis, we'll start off. If you could introduce yourself, and then I have a whole bunch of questions for you. We'll get right into
it. Well, I know how to say good morning in Tahltan, so Chocholona Hote, Chaskia as Zetsa Talsadan de Deni, the Otsi, Candis Ushia. So I'm from the Crow clan in the Tahltan Nation, and my name is Candis Callison. I am also an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in both the School of Journalism, Writing and Media, as it's now called, and in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so happy that you've agreed to chat. I didn't give you any kind of heads up on what we would be talking about today, which is the best style of interview. But I met you because I spoke in your class, and you kind of just let me share some of my experiences and big ideas. And I was so happy to meet you and find out about your work and your book, which I'll just throw up here, Reckoning Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. And I'd love to hear about, how that response has been. But really, you were one of the first people, for me, in my experience, who I saw was really investigating the culture of journalism in so-called North America, and was really challenging journalism as we know it, especially mainstream media, the practice both in the newsrooms and then what we actually were seeing, what people were consuming. And I was so hungry for that, because when I joined the world of journalism, I was like, this is really problematic and oppressive and, harmful. So I started giving little workshops, and I've just been following the footsteps of folks like you who've been doing this for years. So could you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in that space, how you first kind of entered that whole world of journalism ethics?
Yeah, well, I did. I'm old, right? So I started out in journalism in the early 90s, actually. So long before APTN, long before, I Don't Know More, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and all of those things, which I think have made journalism a lot better. Still a long ways to go. But yeah, so when I started out, there were, hardly any Indigenous people you would see. In fact, I'm trying to think of somebody I remember seeing, but part of what motivated me to get into it is I wanted to see more people who looked like me. I wanted to hear Indigenous people in media. And so I got a job working for one of the very few Indigenous producers, and I worked on a documentary series and then moved over to the CBC. Worked there for quite a while, doing anything and everything, radio, television. And then there was a brand new station that launched in Vancouver. So that's where I got my on-air start. We launched the very first, long-running show on Indigenous issues at the time. So this was like 1997, and it went national on CTV. So, I was super excited about, finally working with an Indigenous producer, and we had an Indigenous cameraman, like from my own nation. So it was really a very cool, exciting time. But I was also really interested in the internet. So that's what took me to the States. I worked there as a reporter and eventually wound my way to grad school, because I was so interested in thinking about what media was doing in the world. And so in grad school, that's where I kind of thought I had left journalism behind. But my research kept taking me back to journalism. So my dissertation was looking at climate change, but I was really interested in what media were doing, but also how media were representing Indigenous stories about climate change. And so that's really, what became my first book, was looking at climate change. And then I ended up in a journalism school. And of course, what do they give the only non-white faculty in a journalism school to teach but media ethics? So so then I was like, oh, okay, let's use all of my work from my PhD and really try to teach media ethics in a different way. And start really thinking about how it is we know what we know, how it is we think about the world from a journalistic stance, and where can we begin to critique professional norms? And so that's really what became the basis for the book. And also I was in conversation with a feminist media scholar, Mary Lynn Young, who was my co-author, and we just kept having these conversations back and forth. And that sort of informed, really, I think, the direction my research took, but also writing this book. And we were so glad when you came to the class. I mean, students were so inspired by your big thinking, and it was really cool.
Well, I've been engaged in this questioning what we think we know. My undergraduate degree was in philosophy. I mean, I love questions and critical thinking. I think it's so important for us to question what we think we know. And as journalists, we have such a responsibility because people take what they read in the news as fact. And in many ways, it's like writing a version of history. And so seeing Red, that book that really investigates the history of newspapers in Canada and really lays it out that Canadian newspapers were used to protect and narrate and reaffirm a colonial agenda and narrative and make a lot of the systems of oppression that were functioning and continue to function in many ways acceptable because of what people were taking as fact. And we don't always think about that. And I think there are, this is something I was talking about in your class as well. We take these standards of journalism like objectivity, for example, which you question in the op-ed that was just released as well in the Star, which was amazing, and also in the book itself. You can tell I'm a big fan, but so let's just talk about some of these standards of journalism that are taken as that people just don't question, but we don't question as much, and objectivity being one of them. Can you share your thoughts around objectivity?
Yeah, it was interesting for me coming back to journalism and coming back to a journalism environment when I first started doing research in my PhD, because I had really been desocialized from the newsroom. And so coming back, it actually gave me this fresh pair of eyes about how it is that journalists operate. And then coming back to a journalism school, right? You're in the midst of students becoming journalists, right? Which is like, you do really adopt a professional stance. I didn't go to journalism school, so I didn't experience that. For me, it was really on the job and kind of soaking up and trying to be what I saw. And so this was also a chance for me to kind of examine my own personal story of how I came to journalism. And it's funny to me because I'm also in conversation on Media Indigena, the podcast with Kim Tallbear and Rick Harp. And, so Rick and I both come from journalism, but Kim doesn't. And so she sometimes is just like, what? They still think objectivity is a real thing? And we're like, yeah, they do. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Because this idea that you can come at something from nowhere, that you can separate yourself from yourself and then come at it, as if the professional tools are enough for you to separate from your own history, your own ways of knowing, your own coming into knowledge. It's sort of like, it's really, it's a big leap. And objectivity in journalism really comes from the history of science, which, that's what I did my PhD in, is history and anthropology of science. So for me, coming back to journalism, I really saw so clearly that the same critiques that, post-colonial and feminist scholars have made of science were really applicable to journalism as well. And they had been, made very few times over the last, 20, 30 years of scholarship. So that was like my first thing, is like, okay, so how do I bring some of that critical scholarship about science in the way that science has also, not recognized that there is a culture of science, that there is an approach to doing science, which is, in some ways very Western, and still and attempts to take the view from nowhere. So all that critique, how do I bring it to journalism and think about it? And has anybody else done it? and there's like maybe one or two authors I could point to within journalism scholarship. Like, so no wonder the profession has no tools, because scholars
Mm-hmm.
also haven't done the critical work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, that's how I've kind of seen this contribution that, both Mary Lynn and I have made with this book, is really to say, okay, hey, scholars, you haven't done the work, but a lot of other scholars have in other ways. And in media
Mm-hmm.
studies, they've been very critical. So how do we bring that into thinking, and how do we apply it within the profession? Like, what does that actually mean? And so the book really argues that journalists are coming from somewhere. I think we say in the op-ed that you know from somewhere, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that knowing from somewhere, how does that impact the kinds of stories you want to do, the kinds of questions you want to ask, and who you think the experts are to consult, right? And so, there are, good methods for evaluating what you're doing as a journalist. And so that's really, kind of what we've tried to just really insert into methods is, and at the same time, I think this profound moment that we're living in, like this profound context, right, really asks us to think very closely about how we want to live together. Like, the kinds of stories we tell, I mean, we know this as Indigenous people, right? The kinds of stories we tell us a lot about who we are and who we think we are and what we think is important, right? So all of that kind of natural glue that journalism provides is really, the stuff that we need to ask a lot of questions about, because it becomes so much more important, the kinds of stories we tell when we're in this moment of real upheaval. So.
Do you believe that in this time we are in a paradigm shift?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so
Right?
I'm like a skeptical of all that stuff.
Well, I catch myself sometimes too, because even in these interviews, I've looked back and I've said something like, I've talked about it, and we catch ourselves, right, doing things, repeating patterns. But I talked about this moment, and then I have to stop and remember how many pandemics that the planet has seen, that people have seen, and even this idea of it's never been more important. We use it because it's flashy and it's seductive and it kind of gets people thinking. And I know you talk a lot about what will make people care, when it comes to the climate. What will make people care? Like, what do we do? How do we dress? How do we dance to make people care about these things? But it's always been important. Like, if you go back to any point in history, and I don't think of time as linear, but if we go to any point, it's always been important. We've always been in a time when there are infinite potentials, and but we are in a very particular time right now, and we haven't seen this kind of technology and internet before on this planet, at least in recent history in our memory. I mean, we could get into some of that stuff as well, but how do you feel about this time right now? What have your thoughts been during COVID-19 and all of these challenges and changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the moment where there's space for change. So what that change looks like, whether or not change occurs, we know historically that what happens is there's a lot of upheaval and people try to bring it back to stability. And in fact, it's one of the things I've thought a lot about in the reporting on what's happening with Black Lives Matter, right? That part of the challenge is that, and we can see this with, Indigenous movements as well. Part of the challenge is that journalism as a keeper of social order wants to bring everything back to stability, or compares the current moment in terms of stability. And I think the one thing I've thought a lot about, especially in relation to climate change, where people are talking about this being a crisis, is just how important are Indigenous stories. And there's so many diverse stories from so many diverse nations, but the thread I find really similar through a lot of Indigenous stories is how we think about change. And how we think about change is that it's always happening, right? Like, in fact, our work as humans is to really think about our relations and how we stay in good relations such that negative changes don't happen, right? If you think about all the traditions in your community. Really, a lot of it is about, okay, so how do we deal with change? Why did change happen? How can we prevent negative changes, right? By making sure that we treat our non-human relatives properly, by making sure that we're, treating our land properly and our waters properly. And there's so many different things we do to show respect, right? So to me, like the question about how change happens and why change happens really, is actually a very cultural. It's really embedded in our cultural views of the world and our cultural approaches to doing life. And so, are we in a moment of a shift? I think we're in a moment where there's space for shifts, and what those shifts look like, how they, impact the structures that we live with, I think is still it's still really, to me, it's really an open question. So I'm on one hand really hopeful, like when I look at what young journalists are doing, when I look at the kinds of conversations, I mean, even in the last week and a half, the kinds of conversations that I've seen amongst journalists is like, I never would have anticipated that, right? Like,
what
I never would have.
Conversation?
Things like, can we be objective? Are we, why aren't there more people of color, Indigenous people, Black people in the newsrooms? How have your experiences been as a Black or Indigenous journalist? Are we doing something wrong when we're reporting on what's happening in Indigenous and Black communities, right? So I think like the tenor of conversation on Twitter is so open, right? Momentarily. And in fact, I feel like we wrote our op-ed before a lot of those conversations were evident. And I feel like the op-ed kind of grabbed from the stuff from the book that could speak into those conversations. So, it's a really interesting moment, and historically we know that things go 2 or 3 steps ahead and then retrench. We know that people want to come back to the status quo. They want to come back to some notion of familiar stability. So yeah. Sorry, I grabbed a lot of stuff there. What's that?
Some notion of normal.
Some notion of normal. Some notion of familiar, comfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I wrote an op-ed last week saying if what was it? If we want to go back to normal, I don't want to go back to normal. If normal meant unfettered capitalism and the ongoing dispossession and incarceration and assassination of certain bodies across the world, like if that's what people want to go back to when that wasn't being again, brought to the surface, then no, I don't, why would we want to go back to that? And do you feel that in many ways over the last months and weeks, I mean, there's always been revolt, there's always been struggle, these issues have always existed. Are they brought to light more? Do we have an obsession with the US and what's happening when there are a lot of similar things happening in other areas of the world? What are your thoughts around these last few weeks?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like it's such tragic deaths for communities to deal with. And I think, to me, watching how the Black community has mourned and really uplifted their community and the suffering that they've experienced. I really appreciated this one quote I saw from a counselor, like a city councilor, I think she was in Minneapolis, who said, like, this is 400 years in the making, right? Which to me just really sounds like, something one of our elders would say, like, this is this is a long time coming. And so, you just really have a lot of respect for the people who are articulating that and who are looking to make system change. I mean, I think to me, that's one of the really interesting moves here is that I feel like, people who are speaking out are saying we've got to make system change. Like the structure has been oppressive and has not served all of these communities. And so like, those are really academic concepts, right? Like I first came to structure and system by becoming academic. I certainly didn't get it as a journalist and as part of the work I've tried to do is also bring that kind of thinking to journalism and say journalism can't think about things as events. They have to think about what they're witnessing, like people in the streets, as events that point to structures and systems that have histories. And in this case, histories of oppression, of, systematic, disenfranchisement, and not, so people can't participate in systems. At the same time, right, we recognize that the systems have been inherently unjust. So how do we shift them away from, right, the normal, the sort of capitalistic norm? So I think, like, to me, that the fact that public discourse is really shifting and thinking more historically and thinking more with systems is, I think, a really important move. And I hope those kinds of conversations lead to the kind of change that people would like to see. At the same time, I think, like, for us as Indigenous people, this is a really interesting moment to figure out how to speak both separately and together. I was super inspired to sit down for an interview with Desmond Cole, who's a Black journalist based out of Toronto, back in January. And I, for the interview, I had to read his book, which, he gets so busy, you don't get a chance to read stuff. And so I really sat down and read his book very closely. And for me, he was one of the very first Black journalists, activists who thought about what was happening to Black communities on a terrain of settler colonialism. So he really thought about how some of the experiences of Black communities were very similar to Indigenous communities, how the statistics were similar, how the school system was, underserving, disserving our communities and our young people in the same way. So to me, I think that conversation is, I think, something that's emerging more broadly. And I think it's really important to listen to people like Desmond Cole, who've really thought closely about this. And there's other Black scholars like Christina Sharp and others who have also really thought closely about this. And to me, that's exciting. Like, it's exciting to have these conversations and to support what's happening with Black Lives Matter, but also to recognize that we need to build relationships and build coalitions. And, Nick Estes, who wrote, what's it called? Our History is the Future, I think. Osheti Sakoin, he, talks about Standing Rock. And recently he was in conversation with Kim Tallbear, is how I know about it. And they he really talked about how important Black Lives Matter was to Standing Rock. And that's a narrative I didn't know, right? So I think like these conversations are really important to have, like, and also, learning how to not speak over each other, but really speak together, and also recognize that our issues and our concerns and priorities also might be slightly different, right? So for Indigenous people, we're really focused on our lands, and here in BC, we're still mostly without treaties. My nation doesn't have a treaty. You think about what happened with Wet'suwet'en people and with the land defense that went on recently, like that. This is and is ongoing, right? Like, land defense is an ongoing approach, stance, experience for so many Indigenous people throughout the Americas, and wrestling with different kinds of state and historical structures. So,
how do you see in your mind that being done? I mean, maybe it's something that's not even worth comment, but how can we talk about some of the forces that are interconnected in some of our struggles and stories, like white supremacy, like global white supremacy, or capitalism, or colonialism, but then at the same time make sure that we're not in this oppression Olympics, or that we're not speaking on behalf, that we're speaking for ourselves, we're speaking where we're meant to speak and supposed to speak, and not speaking on others, but then also not remaining silent. Like, is there a way that you've come to learn that can be done in a good way?
Yeah, so sometimes I can be so academic, so I'm really trying to not be that right now. But like, part of part of my learning from studying climate change is that language, we only know how to use language by using it. And so to me, I really see this moment as a more broad learning process where we're learning how to use language together to talk to, and inventing language in some ways about how to think about ourselves
Mm.
together. So that is a process, right? Like it's going to take some time and some cooperation and some alliances and some failures, right? And some experiments. Like I think we've got to be willing to try and fail and be corrected. Like there's a humility that's required to
Mhm.
to learn how to speak together,
Mhm.
because so much of you know so so much of both what's happened in Indigenous and Black communities specifically, and we can also talk about how to speak together with other communities of color, immigrant communities. But like, just because this is top of mind right now, like this learning, it requires some humility. Like when I read Desmond Cole's book, I was really inspired because I had just come from the US and I had lived in Princeton, New Jersey for a year as a visiting professor at Princeton University. And they really were still trying to think about what it meant to be on Lenape land, right? So the
Right.
year that I was there, first of all, truthfully, I hadn't done enough research. I didn't realize they had no Indigenous faculty. We take for granted that Musqueam people and the University of British Columbia have worked together to build a relationship. And I really have so much respect for Musqueam leaders and elders who've built that relationship and had to deal with the real colonial mindset of universities, of the state, all of those things that have made living in this region, I think, really difficult for Indigenous people, since the beginning of colonialism here. So going to Princeton, I was shocked, first of all, that there was, sort of no broader acknowledgement in anything of Lenape people, many of whom were displaced to Oklahoma. So there was no it was just shocking to me. And I held this climate change conference with Indigenous scholars and journalists from Canada and the US. And we had a scholar come from the UK who is Siberian Ebony. It was really, really great. And I was like, well, we have to open with Lenape people. And they were like, "Whoa, we I was like, okay, well, this is how we do it on the West Coast, so that's how we're gonna
Right.
do it." So for the first time, they invited a Lenape person to campus to open. He was the
Mhm.
most incredible individual, and I was like, thank you for. I finally felt welcomed to the
Right.
territory, right? Like it was very special, and then. And important, right? Like an important
Mhm.
intervention, not just special for me personally, but like an important
Mhm.
intervention, I think, to the wider university. And then successive conferences invited other Lenape people because they're a fairly big people group,
Mhm.
and they're like a student organized conference invited another group, and then the last conference of the year was organized by an artist friend of mine, Fazal Sheikh, whose image is on the cover of our book, and
Mm.
he invited people from Oklahoma. Like he had enough funding to bring Lenape leaders from Oklahoma, and it was so powerful because they said, we want a relation, like in that way that Indigenous people say, we want a relationship with you. And so I felt like there is all this work, but at the same time, what was happening with Black scholars was quite separate. And I had a meeting towards the end of the year where they were like, well, we just got done acknowledging the situation regarding the Black communities, and Princeton was one of the few Ivies that actually had slaves on campus, and so they really had a lot of work to do there, like a lot of work to do. And I was like, okay, well, this is this other work. And it really felt like it was brought into a competition. I'm like, no, 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 these conversations are together. We have to talk about this stuff together. And so I left thinking, okay, so this is work to do, right? This is work to language this and to talk together. And, and I think there's people still at Princeton trying to do that work. But luckily I came back to BC, where that's, I go back to doing my other work around journalism. And so when I read Desmond Cole's book, I was like, okay, this is the conversation that I think maybe here, where we've had a lot more Indigenous visibility in media, where we've had things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Idle No More really reorient conversations in a way that maybe the learning of how to talk together, I think is a little further along in some ways, at least than my experience living in the U.S. So, and I've lived in the U.S. before, but yeah.
I've had some similar thought processes being here in so-called Brazil, where there's a telenovela there's telenovela at every hour, but there's one that comes on at 6 p.m. and shows, it's just, there's a lot of work to do all over the place in terms of just like consciousness building and realizing what is acceptable or what's not. But in the novella, there's white folks dressed up as Indians, face painted, feathers, and it's just an acceptable, and this is a country where Indigenous leaders have continued to be killed, in remote areas for defending their lives and lands and rights and ancestors and relatives, and future generations, and how that's all connected. So thank you for sharing that. I want to be able to offer some practical advice for journalists. So I have two questions that I definitely want to ask you. The first one, if we could just go back and forth, what are some words that you don't use? What are some words that you don't use in your writing that you maybe would tell your students, encourage your students perhaps not to use? For example, I don't use the word, I don't say, wow, you're a real pioneer. Okay, so yeah. Let's just create a little bit of, a working list here. So pioneer is one. I don't use the term third world, like third world countries or third world conditions. Are there any that come to mind for you?
Yeah. I always know them when I experience them, right? When we
yes, right. When you hear them and you're like,
where'd you pull that one out of?
Yeah.
Well, and it goes back to language, right? Like we know how to use things because we use them.
Right.
And I feel like one of the things I really, maybe it's also from having lived in the US again last year, I really think the mythological underpinnings of how both Canada and the US have emerged are really important to critique at every turn. And so I don't know if I have a specific word, but the two founding nations. Okay.
Right.
Like in Canada, that's a thing.
Yeah.
In the US, these ideals that somehow exclude both the genocidal foundings of the nation, but also actually exclude from the narrative. So one of my learnings, the student organized conference at Princeton invited the Ramapo Lenape, and they told a story I had never heard, right? That they provided the iron ore that George Washington used to run a chain under the Delaware, and that the deal they made was that they could always stay in place, right? They were one of the few that did not get moved to Oklahoma. And I was like, that is a story no one has heard. So to me, like the ways in which the histories um, of both Canada and the US get shorthanded.
Mhm.
And the kind of the ways in which it's still not taught um, in the profound way that I think it should be
Mhm.
in schools. Like this, I think that's still the work to do all the
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And part of the challenge, right, for journalists is that they didn't learn this in school either, right? Like
Right.
you think
Right.
it,
That's what makes them not objective.
right, exactly, right. But this is the real this is the real challenge, right? That you have to go in and try to learn a history you didn't know. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
that,
yeah. I try and explain that in some of the conversations that I have around journalism ethics and anti-oppressive approach to journalism as I'm learning and understanding. But around again that topic of objectivity and this idea, like you said, view from nowhere, that someone is somehow neutral, that the best journalists are the people who don't vote, like they just don't have any, which like that's some, I met those folks, but I mean, as if you hadn't been educated by a certain system, as if you haven't been raised in your family and those legacies and haven't been influenced by the entertainment industry that we have to interact with, whether consensually or not. Like there are so many influences. And if we are not investigating our subconscious beliefs, our, preconceived biases, the stories we carry around, if we're not doing that critical thinking and that examination, which not all, but many academics or philosophers or folks who come from other stories and traditions do naturally, then you're carrying all of that in, like you said, into your work, into the questions you ask, the people you speak to, the quotations you include, the framing. There's so much of that goes into the stories. How has that affected the way that journalists report on so-called climate change and the so-called climate crises? I know you talk about this quite a bit, but could you share a bit more on that?
yeah. Well, I've got like a ton of different threads to think about. Okay, so
Right.
let me um, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of climate change, so much of our priority for journalists is really to think about the new, the now. And that has been like the thing that has plagued climate change for so long. Like if there's an economic crisis, that's going to take precedence over thinking about long-term environmental, damage, trends, etc.,
Mhm.
projections. So that's one aspect of it. And the other is that, science hasn't necessarily been able to give us sort of exactly what's going to happen. We're dealing with a range of probabilities and possibilities. So how to think through those really involves thinking again about how do we want to live together, about what kinds of futures, what kinds of structures, what kinds of relationships do we want to protect, actually. And I
Mhm.
think those larger questions often fall out of journalistic approaches,
Mhm.
and they are the big questions, right? What are the state of our relations? How do we maintain good relations, right? That, to me, this is where so much of the attention from media in particular, but also scholars around Indigenous knowledge has been like, filling in the historical record. Okay, well, so, your traditional stories tell us that the glacier looked like this. Okay, so we can, extrapolate from that to our baseline data most recently, and then tell you what we think the glacier is going to do. So it's like really, probably a glaciologist would be horrified at my summary. Okay,
I'm
but
not a glaciologist personally, so go ahead.
so but the challenge is that I think Indigenous approaches, knowledge, thinking about the world actually gives us a whole set of different kinds of questions, right? And to me, that's where we need to go, is really thinking about that. And I see Indigenous journalists doing that more. And I think because Indigenous journalists really approach things more historically, generally, generally tend to also think about accountability to community in a different way. Think about themselves as situated within social networks and histories, and think about their communities as always pushing against, capitalist colonial systems, and with their own knowledge and governance and systems. And so I think like already coming from that perspective really gives you a different approach to thinking about something like climate change. And in the book, we interviewed Mark Trahant, who's the editor of Indian Country Today. And I mean, I still think about his quote a lot. Like he's like, there's a 10,000 year history that we need to be considering here, right? Like we need to be really thinking about how we've, had very similar structures in the distant past, and structures of experiences, and how we've approached those. And so that gives us a basis for thinking about how to navigate the future. And I think to me that that notion of how we go forward together, how we think about the future, and that there are multiple possible futures, right? There's multiple ways to address, understand, respond to the range of probabilities that are in front of us. And mainstream society, actually has a quite narrow range of approaches, and a lot of it is founded on, sort of centralized control. It's, founded on standardization, and those things can be important tools. But you also need to continually question then, how that looks at the periphery, what gets lost when you standardize, climate measurements, right? Yeah.
Do you see, I know you've mentioned you do see changes. You do see a little bit of chipping away at that culture, especially within, I think, independent media, independent newsrooms, and there are certain journalists. Are you seeing that happen in the New York Times, in the Guardian, in the Washington Post? Are you seeing that happen, shifts in mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's slow, and I think it's, again, like a lot of change, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
You mean Trump?
Well, no, that's a lot more steps back.
That's
Sorry.
But that means we're going way forward, right?
I mean, yeah, maybe. So yeah, yeah, it's a challenge to think about how much change is occurring,
Right.
because media is in such a state of change itself. I mean, one of the things Mary Lynn and I push against in the book is this notion that the crisis impacting journalism is just economic and technological, right? So
Right.
in my lifetime in media, right, this last 25, 30 years, I'm not old, so but in the last, let's say 20, 25 years,
Yeah.
you really have seen massive changes, right? The fact that we can do this, I'm sitting in my house, you're in Brazil, we're having a pretty solid conversation. And by solid, I mean like the technology remains stable, right? Like that.
Candis, they don't know what I'm doing. Don't tell anybody. Yeah.
Also, right, that's actually the gift of technology, is that it makes it more experimental. And to me, that's where great new ideas, journalism approaches come out of that experimental stage, right? That experimentation. And so, that's a really good thing. Like in the book, we argue that there's multiple journalisms emerging. And so this crisis, you can see in two ways. You can see it as a moment of experimentation, and you can see it as a more profound crisis, because actually all of the critique from Black, Indigenous, other communities of color about how media have reported on them, have reported on issues of concern for them, all that critique from scholars, from communities, have also been brought to the fore, so that when media does something wrong, there's an instant response on Twitter. You really have seen that over the last couple of weeks, where journalists have and editors have had to, contend with pushback, right? You can think about the New York Times specifically in that respect. And I think where you see real improvements is where you have Indigenous people as meaningful either collaborators and advisors or in the newsroom, and preferably in the newsroom, and more than just one in the newsroom, right? Which would be my experience in media. Being it's truly the only, I mean, so I think like that's the hopeful terrain that we can think about. And the Guardian, right, it has done very good when they've reported on Indigenous communities in Australia. And why is that? Because they have people in Australia, and I think they had an Indigenous journalist with them for a while from Australia. Like that's when you see real change, I think, is when you have Indigenous journalists working on stories of concern to communities that they know well, right? I would tell the same story about you at the National Observer, right? Like that, it matters. It really does matter where you're coming from,
right?
And especially on communities that have not been reported on very well.
Well, and when I first was, in this, like, am I going to be a journalist? What is this? I spoke with Keone Lee of Oiwi TV in Hawaii, right? The Kingdom of Hawaii. And I was talking to him, so what's the best approach to start totally from the outside, to be on the inside, of different media outlets that already have an audience, or to go totally just work with a team of Indigenous or people of color or people who have that ethic embodied? Like what? And he said, well, we need people everywhere, right? We need people in all spaces at this point. That's what it needs to be. And he, talked about the risk of just like repeating, if there's not that really self-critical process that happens, just repeating, like just creating another CBC, but just, filled with different looking people. So not repeating those same kind of structures, like you're talking about structures and systems. But in your experience, working on your own, working independently, working in spaces like Media Indigena with all Indigenous folks and helping that run, and then being on the inside of an institution like CBC, do you agree with that sentiment that there needs to be people in all spaces, holding gateways, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's very complex to both try to move older structures like the CBC. I think it's really hard to move practices when if you look at the just purely statistics, right? You have this really like over 95% of employees are not from communities of color or Black communities or Indigenous communities, right? So
over 95%.
Is that right? It might be over 90. It might be over 90. Don't quote me.
But I just wanted to make sure
or it might be just like 89%. But it's like it's a really high. It's a really high percentage, right? I think they only have. I'm mixing up my statistics with NPR, CBC. Like in my mind, I should have had it in front of me. Sorry.
No.
But it's not much more than it's like 10.9% or it's 10%.
Right.
Or less.
I mean,
but anyway, so really like
shocking.
So you're asking, in some cases, one or two people who work on a show to move it, and when you have quite a number of staff, or you have a big, media center. So I think like that's really different kind of hard work. And I think sometimes, like what I've seen in interviewing Indigenous journalists is they often go in and out of those spaces, right? So they go off and do something independently. They go off and, start something else, which might question the way things get done. And, I think like Media Indigena is a really good example of that, right? Like where, the kinds of conversations we have on there are not the kinds of conversations you could have on a CBC radio show, for example, right? Like, so I think like that process of change, of, you know, how, you know, new ideas come to fruition, like those are fascinating. And for Indigenous journalists, I think you have to do what's right for you, because there's only so much you can deal with in the system. There's only so much change you can make. So if you need to get out for a while, if you need to do something different, if you need to work with Indigenous, other Indigenous producers and journalists, then that's what, you know, that might be the important next development for you. For me, even just having these, you know, every 2-week conversations on Media Indigena has been wonderful, right? Like in my department, there were, you know, up until very recently, it was, there were no people of color on faculty. Like there's now one other person. And, you know, and we've had some fairly well-known adjuncts who've worked with us intermittently. You know, Duncan McHugh has done a great job with reporting in Indigenous communities, but that doesn't mean you're, you know, like he doesn't have to do faculty meetings and think about curriculum and those kinds of things. So, so I think like the challenge is to have enough support to do the kinds of things you want to do, and to find ways to navigate the bigger systems and structures if that's where you are, and have outlets outside of it, you know, everybody navigates that differently, and you've got to recognize that it's exhausting to be the only or one of 2 or 3 in a newsroom setting when you have this, you know, 100 years of people thinking they can be objectives. Really, like, and it's like objectivity emerges in newsrooms in North America in the 1920s, and here we are in 2020, right?
And the value systems that shape the way that things are done, you know, the relationship, a lot of it, right? It's like you said, it's complicated and it's complex, and it's difficult to have to constantly explain, you know, certain parts of the process that are not culturally appropriate, you know, at the very least, oppressive as well at other times. But Candis, our time is kind of trickling to an end here, but I wanted to just ask if you had anything on your mind lately, anything on your mind or heart that you wanted to talk about, wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean,
otherwise, you know, I have more questions. But.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I've sort of talked about the way, like, I am really thinking a lot about how we speak together and separately. I mean, what's been happening with Black Lives Matter has really been top of mind for me. At the same time, recognizing that we, in this same period in which we're, you know, mourning the death of George Floyd and many others, that we've also had Indigenous deaths in Canada, right? We had a young woman, Chantel Moore, from a New Channel people, and I can't never. Yeah, okay, right. So Cleoquit. So she, you know, she was killed by police in New Brunswick, right? Like these, you know, this moment of trying to talk together and think together about our experiences with the state, with structures, with, you know, the persistence of violence like that, and how or whether how we talk about it makes a difference. You know, how we go forward together, what kinds of conversations we field. I think, you know, this is an important time. You know, as much as I'm sort of a who knows how much change is going to happen, I do think it's an important time. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, thank you for that. It's important to mention, especially Chantel Moore, you know, murdered last week, and it's like there's never an end, you know, in a way. It is constant. And I agree. I do think that this is a very important time. And I've been called an optimist. I don't self-identify, you know, but also skeptical, and I think that comes with generational thinking and trying to push back on anthropocentric, this idea that humans are the center of the universe, which is a very colonial capitalist idea. But trying to push back on that, you want to remain hopeful and charged and get to know your responsibilities in the whole story, whether that's cultural or understanding how we fit into the collective and what our jobs are. And so I'm trying to do that as well, understand what the responsibilities are and think of the longer term, both looking back and looking forward and all around, and then also to be well and to take care, because we have to do that work as well. So I hope that you're taking care and your family's taking care and are as well as possible, because we value you so much and your work that you do. And I look up to you so much every time I see that you publish an op-ed or an article or are on Media Indigena. I'm just, I want you to know that I'm like totally, you can tell, totally tuned in, and just, so grateful for you speaking into this space and empowering me to speak into this space as well. And so that we continue, as we are in this time of metamorphosis, we continue to raise the standard of journalism. And even if folks don't always connect, they don't feel the same things, if there is a higher level of accountability, then people will change their behavior. So thank you for doing that work and paving that way in many ways.
Oh, thank you for having me here in conversation with you. But also, I am a big fan of yours. So this is a mutual admiration. I am.
We're super biased.
Yeah, exactly. We are not objective.
Yeah.
I really admire and appreciate your work, and I think it's so needed. Like the article you did on Indigenous journalists was just so profound. I teach with it. I think that you really gathered, a great set of voices, including my own. But really, I think that was an intervention in some ways. I don't think that's a story many people have heard, and I have so much respect for a lot of other work you've done too. So I really encourage you to keep going. And in fact, part of my motivation in writing this book with Mary Lynn Young, we have a whole chapter on Indigenous journalism where we cite that article in particular, and it is to support the work like you're doing. I'm at the latter stage of my career, and I sort of see that my work at this point is really to support and lift up the kind of work that young journalists like yourself are doing. So
you look 30. I mean,
thank you.
I'm like all tan jeans, I think. I'm like, you keep making jokes about your age, and I'm like, you look like you're 30 years old. Not a vein.
I turned 49 this year. It's like it's really like,
okay, good. Age is wisdom, experience.
It's true, right? Like, I am so grateful for all my my aunties who like look fabulous in their 70s and are so wise and amazing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time this morning. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and let's continue to be in touch. We'd love to have you back on here, and I'm always happy to be involved in any way.
I do, Emilee. Appreciate it.
Hi. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. You've had a lot of, I don't know if you've been seeing the comments, you can check them out later, but lots of thanks. People are excited. I know that Kelsey, for example, is a new journalist, just joined the Indigenews.
Great.
That was just launched. And so I know she's a big fan as well and has been tuning in. So
awesome.
Yeah, there's other journalists.
And I see Vicky George. Hi, Vicky.
Yeah, Vicky George is here. Sandra Henning, Susan Leach. Lots of good friends here. Tanya Dick. So everyone have a great weekend. Take good care.
Take good care.